4 days. 6 days if raining.
Rowant was the third wagoner I'd asked about going north to Imre, the town nearest the university. He was a thick-bodied Kieldish man with a fierce black beard that hid most of his face. He turned away and barked curses in Siaru at a man loading a wagon with bolts of cloth. When he spoke his native language, he sounded like an angry rock slide. His rough voice lowered to a rumble as he turned back to me.
2 coppers. Jorts, not pennies. You can ride in a wagon if there is space. You can sleep underneath at night if you want. You eat in the evening with us. Lunch is just bread. If a wagon gets stuck, you help push.
There was another pause while he shouted at the men. There were 3 wagons being packed with trade goods, while the 4th was achingly familiar, one of the wheeled houses I had spent most of my early life riding. Rowant's wife, Rita, sat in the front of that wagon. Her mien wavered from severe, when she watched the men loading the wagons, to smiling when she spoke with the girl standing nearby. I assumed the girl was a passenger like myself. She was my age, perhaps a year older, but a year makes a great deal of difference at that time of life. The Tal have a saying about children of our age: the boy grows upward, but the girl grows up. She was dressed practically for travelling, pants and shirt, and was just young enough for it not to seem improper. Her bearing was such that if she had been a year older, I would have been forced to see her as a lady. As it was, when she spoke with Rita, she moved back and forth between a genteel grace and a childlike exuberance. She had long, dark hair and, simply said, she was beautiful. It had been a long time since I had seen anything beautiful. Rowant followed my gaze and continued.
Everyone helps set camp at night. Everyone takes a turn watching. You fall asleep during your watch, you get left behind. You eat with us, whatever my wife cooks. You complain, you get left behind. You walk too slow, you get left behind. You bother the girl.
He ran a hand through his thick, dark beard.
Bad things happen.
I watched as Rowant went to speak to his wife. The dark-haired girl looked in my direction and smiled. I looked away, not knowing what to make of it. He shrugged.
I'll leave you to fetch your things then. Rowant's all growl and not much gruff, but he won't wait once the wagons are packed.
I nodded, even though my things were non-existent. I did have a little shopping to do. They say you can find anything in Tarbean, if you have enough money. For the most part, they're right. A final flurry of preparation was being made as I arrived. Rowant paced around the wagons like a restless animal, checking everything again and again. Rita watched the workers with a stern eye and a quick word for anything that wasn't being done to her satisfaction. I was comfortably ignored until we headed out of the city, towards the university. As the miles rolled away, it was as if a great weight slowly fell away from me. I revelled in the feel of the ground through my shoes, the taste of the air, the quiet hush of wind brushing through the spring wheat in the fields. I found myself grinning, for no good reason, save that I was happy. We, Rue, are not meant to stay in one place for so long. I took a deep breath and nearly laughed out loud. I kept to myself as we travelled, not being used to the company of others. Rowant and the mercenaries were willing to leave me alone. Derek joked with me off and on, but generally found me too reserved for his tastes. That left the other passenger, Denna. We didn't speak until the first day's ride was nearly done. I was riding with one of the mercenaries, absently peeling the bark from a willow switch. While my fingers worked, I studied the side of her face, admiring the line of her jaw, the curve of her neck into her shoulder. I wondered why she was travelling alone and where she was going. In the middle of my musing, she turned to look in my direction and caught me, staring at her. "Penny for your thought?" she asked, brushing at an errant strand of hair. "I was wondering what you're doing here," I said half honestly. Smiling, she held my eyes. Liar. I used an old stage trick to keep myself from blushing, gave my best unconcerned shrug and looked down at the willow wand I was peeling. After a few minutes, I heard her return to her conversation with Rita. I found myself strangely disappointed. After camp was set and dinner was cooking, I idled around the wagons examining the knots Rowant used to lash his cargo into place. I heard a footfall behind me and turned to see Denna approaching. My stomach rolled over, and I took a short breath to compose myself. She stopped about a dozen feet from me. Have you figured it out yet? She asked. Excuse me? Why I'm here? She smiled gently. I've been wondering the same thing for most of my life, you see. I thought, if you had any ideas... She gave me a wry, hopeful look. I shook my head, too uncertain of the situation to find the humor in it. All I've been able to guess is that you're going somewhere. She nodded seriously. That's as much as I've guessed, too. She paused to look at the circle the horizon made around us. The wind caught her hair and she brushed it back again. Do you happen to know where I'm going? I felt a smile begin a slow creep onto my face. It felt odd. I was out of practice smiling. Don't you know? I have suspicions. Right now, I'm thinking aniline. She rocked onto the edges of her feet, then back to the flats. But I've been wrong before. A silence settled over our conversation. Denna looked down at her hands, fidgeting with the ring on her finger, twisting it. I caught a glimpse of silver and a pale blue stone. Suddenly she dropped her hands to her sides and looked up at me. Where are you going? The university. She arched an eyebrow, looking 10 years older. So certain? She smiled and was suddenly young again. How does it feel to know where you're going? I couldn't think of a reply, but was saved from the need for one by Rita calling us for supper. Denna and I walked toward the campfire together. The beginning of the next day was spent in a brief, awkward courtship. Eager, but not wanting to seem eager, I made a slow dance around Denna before finally finding some excuse to spend time with her. Denna, on the other hand, seemed perfectly at ease. We spent the rest of the day as if we were old friends. We joked and told stories. I pointed out the different types of clouds and what they told of the weather to come. She showed me the shapes they held, a rose, a harp, a waterfall. So passed the day. Later, when lots were being drawn to see who had which turn at watch, Denna and I drew the first 2 shifts. Without discussing it, we shared the 4 hours of watch together. Talking softly so as not to wake the others, we sat close by the fire and spent the time watching very little but each other. The 3rd day was much the same. We passed the time pleasantly, not in long conversation, but more often watching the scenery, saying whatever happened to come to our minds. That night we stopped at a wayside inn, where Rita bought fodder for the horses and a few other supplies. Rita retired early with her husband, telling each of us that she'd arranged for our dinners and beds with the innkeeper. The former was quite good, bacon and potato soup with fresh bread and butter. The latter was in the stables, but it was still a long sight better than what I was used to in Tarbean. The common room smelled of smoke and sweat and spilled beer. I was glad when Denna asked if I wanted to take a walk. Outside was the warm quiet of a windless spring night. We talked as we wended our slow way through the wild bit of forest behind the inn. After a while, we came to a wide clearing circling a pond. On the edge of the water were a pair of waystones, their surfaces silver against the black of the sky, the black of the water. One stood upright, a finger pointing to the sky. The other lay flat, extending into the water like a short stone pier. No breath of wind disturbed the surface of the water. So as we climbed out onto the fallen stone, the stars reflected themselves in double fashion, as above, so below. It was as if we were sitting amid a sea of stars. We spoke for hours, late into the night. Neither of us mentioned our pasts. I sensed that there were things she would rather not talk about, and by the way she avoided questioning me, I think she guessed the same. We spoke of ourselves instead, of fond imaginings and impossible things. I pointed to the skies and told her the names of stars and constellations. She told me stories about them I had never heard before. My eyes were always returning to Denna. She sat beside me, arms hugging her knees. Her skin was more luminous than the moon, her eyes wider than the sky, deeper than the water, darker than the night. It slowly began to dawn on me that I had been staring at her, wordlessly, for an impossible amount of time. Lost in my thoughts, lost in the sight of her. But her face didn't look offended or amused. It almost looked as if she were studying the lines of my face, almost as if she were waiting. I wanted to take her hand. I wanted to brush her cheek with my fingertips. I wanted to tell her that she was the first beautiful thing I had seen in 3 years, that the sight of her yawning to the back of her hand was enough to drive the breath from me. How I sometimes lost the sense of her words in the sweet fluting of her voice. I wanted to say that if she were with me, then somehow nothing could ever be wrong for me again. In that breathless second, I almost asked her. I felt the question boiling up from my chest. I remember drawing a breath, then hesitating. What could I say? Come away with me? Stay with me? Come to the university? No. Sudden certainty tightened in my chest like a cold fist. What could I ask her? What could I offer? Nothing. Anything I said would sound foolish. A child's fantasy. I closed my mouth and looked across the water. Inches away, Denna did the same. I could feel the heat of her. She smelled like road dust and honey and the smell the air holds seconds before a heavy summer rain. Neither of us spoke. I closed my eyes. The closeness of her was the sweetest, sharpest thing my life had ever known. The next morning I blearily awoke after 2 hours of sleep, bundled myself onto one of the wagons and proceeded to drowse away the morning. It was nearly noon before I realized that we had taken on another passenger at the inn last night. His name was Josson, and he had paid Rowant for passage to Annalyn. He had an easy manner and an honest smile. He seemed an earnest man. I did not like him. My reason was simple. He spent the entire day riding next to Denna. He flattered her outrageously and joked with her about becoming one of his wives. She seemed unaffected by the late hours we had kept the night before, looking as bright and fresh as ever. The result was that I spent the day being irritated and jealous while acting unconcerned. Since I was too proud to join their conversation, I was left to myself. I spent the day thinking sullen thoughts, trying to ignore the sound of his voice and occasionally remembering the way Denna had looked last night, with the moon reflecting off the water behind her. The weather held fair, which meant that the wagons rolled into Imre just as the sun was setting. My mood was sullen and hurt. Denna had shared a wagon with Josson the whole of the day, and I, being foolish and proud, had kept my distance. A whirl of activity sprang up as soon as the wagons rolled to a stop. Rowant began to argue with a clean-shaven man in a velvet hat before he had brought his wagon to a full stop. After the initial bout of bargaining, a dozen men began unloading bolts of cloth, barrels of molasses, and burlap sacks of coffee. I slung my travel sack over my shoulder and looked around one last time, thinking that perhaps It would be best if I left without any troublesome goodbyes. Denna was nowhere to be seen. That settled it then. I turned to leave and found her standing behind me. She smiled a little awkwardly with her hands clasped behind her back. She was lovely as a flower and totally unconscious of it. I was suddenly short of breath and I forgot myself, my irritation, my hurt. "You're still going?" she asked. I nodded. "You could come to Annalyn with us," she suggested. "They say the streets are paved with gold there. You could teach Jocelyn to play that lute he carries around." She smiled. "I've asked him, and he said he wouldn't mind." I considered it. For half a heartbeat, I almost threw my whole plan aside just to stay with her a little longer. "Don't look like that," she chided me with a smile. "I'll be there for a while, if things don't work out for you here." She trailed off hopefully. I didn't know what I could do if things didn't work out for me here. I was hanging all my hopes on the university. Besides, Annalyn was hundreds of miles away. I barely owned the clothes on my back. How would I find her? Denna must have seen my thoughts reflected on my face. She smiled playfully. "I guess I'll just have to come looking for you then." We Rue are travellers. Our lives are composed of meetings and partings with brief, bright acquaintances in between. Because of this, I knew the truth. I felt it, heavy and certain in the pit of my stomach. I would never see her again. Before I could say anything, she looked nervously behind her. "I'd better go. Watch for me." She flashed her impish smile again before turning to walk away. "I will," I called after her. "I'll see you where the roads meet." She glanced back and hesitated for a moment, then waved and ran off into the early evening twilight.